look, we've had days of mayhem caused by his tweets over government immigration policy, but should TV personalities like Gary Lineker be allowed to share their opinions on political issues while working for the BBC, even if they are a sports reporter, not a news journalist?
Well, joining us now, a former teammate of Gary Lineker, John Barnes, who stands by the presenter, and a former colleague of mine,
teammate,
the ex-BBC newsreader Simon McCoy, who is a long-time critic of Lineker's tweeting habits. Did that bring back good or bad memories, Simon?
Fabulous memories, but they go back a while, don't they?
Don't they just? I just like to point out I was very pregnant in that photograph. Look, talk to us about why you have an issue and why perhaps other BBC News staff have an issue with what Gary Lineker said.
Well, I've got a total feeling of déjà vu about all this because 3 years ago when I was at the BBC, I criticised Gary for a tweet he did then. And he pointed out at the time, and rightly, that actually he wasn't in breach of the rules. It happened again 2 years later, and it's happened again now. And in the meantime, we've got a new Director General who said he was putting impartiality at the heart of his tenure as Director General. I've got a horrid feeling, if they're saying that Gary will be back on air this weekend, that there's going to be a sort of fudge where it does not tackle the issue at the heart of this, which is, and there are two groups of people who are being forgotten in this. One is the licence fee payers who do not pay directly more than £1 million to a presenter to express his views, public money, and the other people who are being ignored in this are BBC staff, journalists across the country, around the world, who have impartiality, as you know, Susanna. It's drummed into you from day one. And if I was a local radio presenter or a producer anywhere, I'd be looking at this in dismay that such a high-profile presenter at the BBC was bringing it into this sort of disrepute. Now, don't get me wrong, I am not saying I disagree with what Gary said. And it's not about free speech. If he wants to say these things, he's more than welcome to do it. In fact, if he stood in Parliament, I'd probably vote for him. But that's not the point. It's about his position as the highest earning presenter at the BBC, a face of the BBC, who has brought it into disrepute. And in any company, that brings huge problems.
John Barnes, your former Manchester United rival, Gary Neville, big Sky commentator, he's actually been on platforms at Labour Party conference with Keir Starmer, urging people to vote Labour. But I just wonder, is it different if you work for Sky than if you work for the BBC? Does Gary Lineker have to be more careful about being political if he works for the tax-funded broadcaster, the BBC?
Well, it really depends on what the rules are. I'm sure from Sky's perspective, they're allowed to do whatever they want to do. However, this impartiality rule that the BBC are pretending to have doesn't really happen because the BBC encouraged Gary in Qatar in the World Cup to be absolutely impartial. So where do the impartiality rules lie? You can criticize people in other countries and other religions, but you can't do it in this country. So this impartiality rule for me does not make any sense whatsoever. I was critical of Gary and the BBC for being completely not being impartial in Qatar, and now all of a sudden, because he's criticizing policy in this country, we're saying that is impartiality rules. We can't have it both ways.
So you think that the rules should be tougher and universally applied so that you don't have any political comment, including when the BBC sanctions it about Qatar?
You open and you can, but you can't do both. Now, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the content of Gary's Gary's contract. I don't know whether he's broken the rules or not. My support is not for Gary Lineker in terms of, whether he's right to say it or not. My support is the content of his tweets in terms of the language used against refugees and the fact that I believe he's completely right in talking about the language used is similar to the language used in Germany in 1930. The outcome is not going to be the same. What he's not suggesting, I'm not suggesting that it's going to be, a genocide towards refugees, but the language used towards the refugees in terms of them being rapists and criminals coming over here is very similar to the language used in Germany in 1930. So I'm supporting his tweet and the content, not necessarily his right to say it, because I don't know whether he has a right or not.
Simon, it's interesting what John Barnes says there. I mean, the point is Gary Lineker tweeted this. He did not use his platform on the BBC to criticise government policy. And as John points out, he has used his platform on the BBC to be political on other occasions. does seem to be a double standard.
John is talking about one specific occasion, which was the Qatar World Cup, and we all remember the build-up to that, and there were massive questions as to whether the BBC should be there at all. And I suspect that Gary and all his colleagues there, and indeed those at the BBC, felt they were in a position where they had to say something because there was huge criticism of it. But it's missing the point to a degree, because here I am in the United States, where there is massive respect for the BBC because it is seen as impartial. We now have the highest paid presenter, the most high profile presenter at the corporation, expressing a political view. Doesn't matter which side it is, but here we are going into possibly a general election in the next 12 months or so. We have the BBC fighting for its survival in terms of how it's going to be funded in future. And if you don't tighten the rules so that this sort of, the ability for someone like Gary to just say what he wants, doesn't matter where, but it's going to be picked up because he is the highest profile BBC presenter. He is the BBC's Gary Lineker. It is not Gary Lineker's BBC. And I think people are getting a bit confused. The fact you've got 7.8 million viewers on Twitter is not comparable to having perhaps the most important job in the corporation in terms of profile. And with that comes huge privilege. There also comes huge responsibility. And I'm afraid, I think, that he's abusing that responsibility when he goes public on Twitter. Doesn't matter where he says it. He knows as a BBC presenter he's being watched.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. John, what did you make of the reactions of other commentators, analysts, presenters? It looks like the BBC has been forced into a position on this because they just couldn't run their sports broadcasting.
Well, I think they have a lot to thank Friends for, because when the Friends cast had negotiations, they all stood together in solidarity, and you saw what the outcome of that was. So I think that they have a lot to thank them for, because, of course, what can they do without the pundits? Now, as I said, I want the conversation to be about the refugees and about the language used, rather than us now being sidetracked as to, Gary Lineker and his right to say it, and are they supporting him? It reminds me of when footballers first started taking a knee. When they took a knee, the conversation was about why they're taking a knee. It quickly descended into, do they have a right to take a knee? And the message was lost. So I want this message to continue in terms of the language used towards refugees and our support for Syrian and Iraqi refugees in the same way that we're supporting Ukrainian refugees, as much as they're invited guests rather than refugees, which seems a bit strange to me.
Of course, we've got the FA Cup quarterfinals on the BBC this weekend. Do you think Gary Lineker will be fronting the coverage?
Well, I've heard that in the next couple of hours, if not a few days, that everything will be back to normal, and it'll be the status quo will be resumed, and it'll be all systems go.
Right. John Barnes, Simon McCoy, good to see you both this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. 8:43.
Who was the better striker, John Barnes or Gary Lineker?